The first thread caught the dawn light like a silver wire suspended in amber. Arachne, though she had no name for herself, stretched each of her 8 legs in sequence, a ritual as old as her species. The corner where the ceiling met the wall had become her kingdom over the past 3 weeks, a geometric masterpiece that would have made human engineers weep. She moved along the radial threads with practiced grace, her body barely heavier than the air itself. Each step was a calculation, each movement deliberate. The web wasn't just a home, it was a trap, a nursery, a legacy. At its center, wrapped in the finest silk she could produce, were 23 eggs. 23 futures, 23 reasons to perfect every angle, every anchor point, every sticky spiral. The morning routine began the same way it always did. Arachne tested each structural thread, plucking them like harp strings, listening with organs humans would never possess. A thread in the upper left quadrant had loosened overnight, probably from the vibrations when the giants closed their bedroom door. She scuttled over, produced fresh silk from her spinnerets, and reinforced the connection. 3 wraps, pulled tight, tested again. Perfect. A fruit fly had made a fatal mistake during the night. Its small body hung in the lower right section, already wrapped for later consumption. Arachne approached it, checked that it was truly dead, and made a mental note. Food was becoming scarcer. The giants had put something in the kitchen, a sweet-smelling bowl of fruit covered with a fine barrier she couldn't penetrate. Clever giants. Frustrating, but clever. She returned to the center, to the egg sac that represented everything. Through the translucent silk, she could sense movement, life. They were developing right on schedule. Perhaps another week, maybe less, and her children would emerge. Hundreds of tiny versions of herself would balloon away on threads of their own, seeking their own corners, their own destinies. Most wouldn't survive. That was the way of things. But some would. Some always did. The room was changing now. The quality of light shifted as the sun climbed higher. Arachne had learned to read the giants' patterns. On days when the light changed like this, they often stayed in their den longer. More time for her to hunt, to reinforce, to prepare. A shadow passed beneath her web. The male giant, walking to what she'd learned was the water room. His footsteps created vibrations that traveled up the walls, through her anchor points, into the web itself. She froze, instinct overriding comfort. In her world, vibration meant danger. But these vibrations came in patterns. Regular, predictable, not a predator. Just the giants, living their incomprehensible lives. She'd been in this corner long enough to understand some things about them. They were loud, but not hunters, at least not hunters of her kind. They moved through their space with the confidence of apex predators, unaware or unconcerned with the smaller lives happening in the margins. Sometimes they would stare at glowing rectangles for hours. Sometimes they would make rhythmic sounds that seemed to please them. Sometimes they brought other giants into the den, and the noise would multiply. But they had never noticed her web, and that was good. That was survival. Arachne spent the next hour doing what she did best: maintenance and improvement. A support thread near the windowsill needed adjustment. The angle wasn't quite right, and if a larger prey item hit the web at speed, it might compromise the whole structure. She crawled down, her body so light that even the most delicate threads barely registered her weight. At the anchor point, she paused. Through the window, the outside world blazed with light and movement. Trees swayed in wind she couldn't feel through the glass. Flying creatures, birds she'd learned they were called from the vibrations of the giant's speech, carved patterns in the blue expanse. It was a world she would never know, a dimension beyond her reach. This room, this corner, this web, this was her universe entire. She adjusted the thread, tested it, adjusted again. Perfect. As she climbed back up, a reflection caught her multiple eyes. Her own form, magnified in a droplet of condensation on the window. 8 legs spread wide, body compact and efficient, designed by 1,000,000 years of evolution for exactly this purpose. Building, waiting, surviving. Back at the center, she performed her final morning ritual, checking each section of the egg sac for any signs of distress. The silk was intact. The temperature, regulated by the room's climate, was stable. Everything was as it should be. In a week, maybe less, her children would emerge, and she would protect them for as long as she could. Then they would scatter, and she would begin again. Build another web, lay more eggs, continue the ancient cycle. A vibration, different this time. Not footsteps, something else. The female giant was moving in the sleeping area. Arachne could feel the change in air pressure as the giant stood. More footsteps, but these were heading in her direction. She pressed herself flat against the ceiling, making her body as small as possible. Invisibility was her greatest defense. The giants rarely looked up, rarely noticed the corners where shadow met light. As long as she stayed still, stayed silent, she would remain undetected. The giant passed below, so massive that Arachne's entire web could have fit in the palm of her hand. The air displacement from her movement caused the web to sway gently, a ship on calm seas. Arachne held position, not breathing, her book lungs sealed shut, conserving oxygen. Seconds passed like hours. Then the giant was gone, disappeared into another room. The vibrations faded. Peace returned. Arachne resumed her position at the center of her web, legs spread across the radial threads, waiting. This was life. Moments of action separated by long stretches of patient stillness. She had food. She had shelter. She had her eggs. By the measures of her kind, she had everything. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the room in shades of gold and white. Dust particles, each one a boulder in Arachne's scale, drifted through the air like lazy snowflakes. One landed on an outer thread of her web, adding an infinitesimal amount of weight. She noted it but didn't bother removing it. Some imperfections were acceptable. Time passed in the way it does for creatures who measure life in vibrations and light shifts, rather than minutes and hours. Arachne dozed lightly, one part of her consciousness always alert, always monitoring the web's integrity. In this state, she dreamed spider dreams, of flies so large they could feed her for days, of perfect webs that never tore, of children who all survived to build their own kingdoms. She didn't dream of brooms, couldn't have conceived of such a thing. In her world, disasters came from other predators, from wind, from the rare occasions when giants would directly swipe at webs they'd noticed. But those were uncommon. Her corner had been safe for so long. She had no way of knowing that the female giant had decided, on this particular morning, that the corners of the room needed attention. No way of understanding what spring cleaning meant. No vocabulary for dusty or neglected or just a quick sweep. The universe was about to remind her that safety is always temporary, that peace is always conditional, that in the margins where small lives unfold, catastrophe can arrive without warning, wearing the innocent face of ordinary routine. But for now, in this moment, everything was perfect. Her web gleamed in the sunlight. Her eggs were safe. And Arachne, the architect, the mother, the survivor, waited at the center of her small cosmos, mistress of all she surveyed. The calm before the storm. The first sign came as a change in air pressure. Arachne's sensors, far more sophisticated than any human instrument, detected it immediately. A displacement somewhere in the den, massive and moving. She froze in her instinctive response, making herself small, invisible against the textured ceiling. The vibrations started next. Not the familiar rhythm of walking. These were different, irregular, purposeful, coming from the far side of the room where the giants kept their sleeping platform. Through the complex network of her web, through the anchor points that connected her world to the walls and ceiling, Arachne felt each tremor like a seismograph recording distant earthquakes. Thump, drag, thump, drag. The pattern repeated, growing closer. The female giant was moving objects, shifting furniture. Arachne had experienced this before. Usually it meant temporary chaos, vibrations that would shake her web but ultimately pass by. She pressed lower, made herself flatter, became a shadow of a shadow. Then came the light, bright, artificial, painful. The giant had pulled back the curtains completely, flooding the room with harsh sunlight that made every thread of Arachne's web suddenly visible. What had been a subtle masterpiece in shadow became a glaring announcement of her presence. But still, the giant didn't look up. Humans so rarely did. The vibrations intensified. Whatever the giant was doing, it was getting closer to Arachne's corner. The entire wall began to resonate with impacts that, to the spider, felt like artillery fire in the distance. Boom, 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 each one stronger than the last. Arachne's primitive brain calculated odds. Stay or flee. The egg sac was here, anchored at the web's center. She couldn't carry it. It was nearly half her body size, carefully wrapped, precisely positioned. Everything in her evolutionary programming screamed one command: protect the eggs. Whatever comes, protect the eggs. She moved to drape herself over the silk-wrapped bundle, her body a living shield. Her 8 legs spread wide, hooking into the radial threads around the sac, creating a cage of her own form. If something came for her children, it would have to go through her first. A new sound joined the symphony of chaos. A whisper of fabric, a rustling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Then Arachne saw it. The giant's hand, enormous beyond comprehension, gripping something long and pale. A wooden shaft that disappeared beyond her field of vision, topped with a mass of brown fibers that looked like a dense forest from Arachne's perspective. The broom had entered her universe. The giant was humming, a sound that vibrated through the air like distant thunder. To her, this was just another chore, another item on an endless list. Clean the bedroom, get the corners. So much dust up there. When was the last time I did this properly? The thoughts would have been mundane, forgettable, the mental background noise of domestic routine. To Arachne, each vibration of that humming was like standing beneath a hovering helicopter. The broom moved across the floor first, sweeping in long strokes that created wind currents Arachne could feel even at ceiling height. Dust particles. Her dust particles, the accumulated debris of weeks that had settled harmlessly on her web's lowest threads, began to swirl into the air. The entire ecosystem of her corner was being disrupted, thrown into chaos by forces beyond her control or comprehension. Then the broom rose. Arachne watched with 8 eyes as the impossible thing lifted off the ground, climbing higher, angling toward the corners where wall met ceiling. The fibers of the broom, each one as thick as a tree trunk in her scale, were stiff with accumulated dust and debris. As it moved through the air, it left a wake of turbulence that made her web shudder. The giant moved to the far corner first, the one opposite Arachne's position. The spider watched as the broom made contact with another web, a smaller one, abandoned weeks ago by a cousin who'd moved on or died. The destruction was instantaneous and total. The broom swept through the delicate structure like a wrecking ball through paper. Threads that had taken hours to construct vanished in a fraction of a second, wrapped around the broom's fibers or scattered into invisible fragments. A single thought pulsed through Arachne's nervous system. Run. But another thought, stronger, overrode it. The eggs. The giant moved to the next corner, humming her tuneless song, completely unaware that she was ending worlds. Another web. This one belonging to a spider Arachne had sometimes sensed through wall vibrations, a neighbor she'd never met but somehow knew existed, was obliterated. The broom passed through it like it was nothing, because to the giant, it was nothing. Just dust, just clutter, just something to be cleaned away. 2 corners down, 2 to go. Arachne could feel her heart, her tiny, simple heart, racing at speeds that would kill a human. Her book lungs pulled at the air frantically. Every instinct was firing at once. Flee, fight, freeze, protect. The chemical signals flooding her nervous system were the spider equivalent of pure terror. The broom was coming closer. She could see it clearly now as the giant pivoted, starting on Arachne's wall. The giant's face was visible too. Not cruel, not evil, just focused in the blank way humans looked when performing tedious tasks. Her eyes were fixed on some distant point, not seeing the individual lives she was about to erase. Just seeing dirty corners that needed to become clean corners. The broom touched the wall 15 inches from Arachne's web. The impact sent a shockwave through every anchor point, making the entire structure sway violently. Dust exploded into the air, Decades of accumulated particles, skin cells, fabric fibers, all the invisible detritus of human existence, launching into orbit around the broom head. And then it swept sideways, directly toward her corner. Time seemed to slow. Arachne could see individual fibers of the broom approaching, each one coated in sticky dust that would destroy her web on contact. She could see the dust cloud rolling ahead of the broom like an advancing wall of destruction. She could see her eggs, still and vulnerable at the center of her web, unaware that their entire future was about to be decided in the next 3 seconds. The wind hit first. The broom's movement pushed air ahead of it, creating a gale-force wind in Arachne's small world. The outer threads of her web, the beautiful, perfect spirals she'd spent days calibrating, began to flutter and tear. Anchor points popped free from the ceiling with sounds like tiny gunshots. The carefully calculated architecture of her home was coming apart. Arachne held tight to the egg sac, her legs locked around it with a strength born of absolute desperation. The wind was trying to tear her free, to send her tumbling into the chaos. Web fragments whipped past her, pieces of her life's work disintegrating in real time. The dust cloud arrived next, a choking wave of particles that clogged her book lungs and coated her eyes. She couldn't see, could barely breathe, could only hold on as her world ended around her. And then, through the dust and wind and destruction, came the broom itself. The first fiber made contact with the outer edge of her web. The fiber hit like a meteor strike. Arachne felt the impact transmitted through every thread still connected to her anchor points. The outer spiral, 2 days of work, perfect logarithmic spacing, ideal sticky coating, simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, the next it was wrapped around the broom fiber or scattered into invisible fragments floating in the dust storm. The giant swept the broom across the corner in a smooth, practiced motion. She'd done this 1,000 times before, would do it 1,000 times again. Just cleaning, just a quick pass to get the cobwebs, nothing important. To Arachne, it was the end of everything. The second pass took out the middle spirals. These were the heart of the web, the primary catching area where prey would get entangled. Weeks of protein investment, countless hours of careful placement. Gone. The radial threads, the structural supports that ran from center to edges, began snapping under the impossible strain. Each break sent a vibration through Arachne's legs like a scream. She felt the egg sac begin to shift. The web beneath it was disintegrating. In seconds, there would be nothing left to support it, and it would fall. A catastrophic drop that would rupture the eggs inside, killing her children before they even had a chance to live. No, the thought wasn't verbal, wasn't conscious in any human sense. It was pure refusal, pure maternal imperative burned into her DNA by millions of years of evolution. She released her grip on the egg sac's top and scrambled beneath it, positioning her body as a platform, her legs finding purchase on the few remaining radial threads. The broom came around for another pass. The giant was being thorough today, really getting into the corner, making sure to clear out all the dust and webs. Her humming had shifted to a new tune, something she'd heard on the radio that morning. The third sweep hit Arachne directly. The sensation was beyond pain. Pain required a nervous system evolved to process it, warning signals about damage. This was something else entirely. This was violation. The broom fiber, coated in sticky dust and other webs and accumulated grime, crashed into her right side with the force of a speeding truck. Arachne's exoskeleton, her armor, her structural support, cracked under the impact. She felt legs crumple, felt her body compress in ways it was never meant to compress. The fiber continued past, ripping her free from her anchor points, sending her tumbling through the air with the egg sac still clutched against her underside. For a fraction of a second, she was airborne. The room spun around her, ceiling, wall, floor, broom, giant, all blurring together. Dust particles that had seemed like slow-moving boulders now zipped past like bullets. The wind roared in her book lungs. Then she hit something hard. A remaining anchor thread, one of the few the broom had missed, caught her abdomen and arrested her fall with a jerk that would have snapped a human's spine. She swung there, dazed, the egg sac miraculously still clutched against her ventral surface. The broom continued its sweep, oblivious. It had moved past her corner now, heading toward the windowsill, still chasing dust that the giant's eyes could see. The worst of the immediate danger had passed, but Arachne's web was gone. Completely, utterly destroyed. She hung from the single thread, her body screaming damage reports. 3 legs on her right side were cracked or broken, barely functional. Her exoskeleton had fractures that wept hemolymph, the clear fluid that served as her blood. One of her eyes was damaged, covered in dust, seeing only blurs. But she was alive, and more importantly, she could feel movement against her underside. The eggs. The eggs were still intact. The giant finished her cleaning and lowered the broom. She looked around the room with satisfaction. Much better, so much cleaner. The corners were clear. The dust was gathered into a neat pile for the vacuum. She'd tackle the rest of the house this afternoon. For now, this room was done. She left, pulling the door closed behind her. The click of the latch was like a thunderclap in the suddenly still air. Silence descended. The dust storm the broom had created began to settle, particles drifting downward like snow in the aftermath of a blizzard. Fragments of Arachne's web, pieces of her life's work, floated in the air, caught in stray light beams, gradually falling to earth. Arachne hung from her single thread, swaying gently. Every movement sent jolts of pain through her damaged body, but she held the egg sac, wouldn't let go, couldn't let go. It was all that mattered. Slowly, fighting against injuries that would have killed most creatures, she began to climb. One leg after another, some barely functional, pulling herself up the thread toward the ceiling. It took forever. Every inch was agony, but inch by inch, she ascended. When she reached the anchor point, one of the few that had survived, she carefully maneuvered the egg sac onto the ceiling itself, into a small crack where the paint had separated from the plaster. It wouldn't protect the eggs from everything, but it was shelter. It was something. Then, and only then, did she allow herself to rest. Her legs spread out around the egg sac, her damaged body draped protectively over it. Through her remaining good eyes, she surveyed what was left of her world. Nothing. The corner that had been her kingdom was empty, bare. Every thread was gone. The architectural masterpiece that had taken 3 weeks to build had been erased in 30 seconds. But the eggs were safe. Damaged, traumatized, barely functional. But she had saved the eggs. And somewhere in her small, simple brain, a new thought formed. Not despair, not surrender. Rebuild. The first thread was the hardest. Arachne waited until night fell, until the giants had quieted in their distant rooms and the house settled into its nocturnal rhythms. Her broken legs had stiffened. Her cracked exoskeleton had partially sealed with clotted hemolymph. She was far from healed, would never fully heal from injuries this severe. But she was functional enough. She had to be. The egg sac remained in its crack, safe for the moment. But it needed more than a crack. It needed a web. The children would emerge in days, and without a structure to support them, they would fall, scatter, die. So she began. The first thread stretched from the ceiling crack to a point on the wall 8 inches away. It should have taken seconds. With her damaged body, it took minutes. Each movement of her spinneret sent pain cascading through her nervous system. The thread that emerged was thinner than optimal, uneven in places where her damaged silk glands struggled to maintain consistent pressure. But it held. She tested it, pulling with her remaining good legs. It would support her weight. Barely, but enough. The second thread ran perpendicular to the first, then a third, creating a basic frame. These weren't the elegant radials of her previous web. This was emergency architecture, function over form, survival over perfection. But it was hers, and it was real, and it was hope made tangible. Through the long night, she worked. Each thread was a small victory against the catastrophe that had nearly ended her. Her broken right legs couldn't grip properly, so she adapted, using her left legs more, shifting her weight differently, compensating in ways her species had learned over millions of years of surviving impossible odds. By dawn, she had a basic structure, 20 radial threads extending from a center point near the egg sac, connected by a few spiral wraps. It wasn't beautiful. A human wouldn't have looked twice at it. But to Arachne, it was a miracle. From nothing, from total destruction, she had created something. She rested as the sun rose, as the giants began their morning routine in other rooms. Every muscle trembled with exhaustion. Her damaged eye had sealed shut completely, reduced to a dark spot on her cephalothorax. But her other eyes could still see, could still watch the egg sac for any signs of movement. And there it was. The faintest flutter inside the silk wrapping. Her children were close. So close. Over the next 2 days, she continued building. Each night, when the giant slept, she added more threads. The web grew slowly, imperfectly, but it grew. She placed the sticky spirals with the same care she always had, even though her damaged spinnerets made them irregular. She reinforced the anchor points, even though each climb to the ceiling sent agony through her broken legs. On the 3rd day, she caught a gnat. Tiny, barely a meal, but it landed in her rebuilt web and stuck. Arachne's heart surged with something that might have been pride. The web worked. Damaged and imperfect, but functional, life-sustaining. She wrapped the gnat carefully, stored it near the egg sac. When the children emerged, they would need food immediately. She would need to catch more, many more, but this was a start. The 4th night, as she added yet another spiral to her web, she felt it. Movement inside the egg sac. Not the flutter of development, but the purposeful pushing of emergence. Her children were coming. Arachne positioned herself at the center of her web, over the sac, and waited. Through the darkness, through the quiet hours when even the giants were still, she waited. The first baby spider emerged at dawn. Tiny beyond imagination, barely visible even to Arachne's eyes, it pushed through the silk wrapping and took its first steps into a world it couldn't possibly understand. Then another, and another. Within an hour, hundreds of tiny spiders covered the egg sac, a writhing mass of infinite potential. They began to move onto her web, testing it, finding it sound despite its imperfections. Some would climb to the highest points and balloon away on threads of silk, trusting the wind to carry them to their destinies. Others would stay close for a while, learning, growing, before setting out on their own. Arachne watched them with her remaining eyes. She had saved them. Through the catastrophe, through the destruction, through pain that should have killed her, she had saved them. The female giant entered the room, starting her morning routine. She glanced at the corner where the spider web had been, nodded with satisfaction at the clean space, and went about her day. She would never know about the struggle that had happened in that corner, would never understand the universe of suffering and triumph that had unfolded in the margins of her casual cleaning. But it didn't matter. The children were safe. The web was rebuilt. Life continued. One of the baby spiders, bolder than the others, climbed onto Arachne's damaged body, testing her texture, her scent. She held perfectly still, let it explore. Then it climbed to her highest point and released a thread, letting the air currents catch it, lifting the tiny creature into flight. Arachne watched it go, sailing toward the window, toward the vast world beyond. One of hundreds, but each one carrying her legacy, her survival, her refusal to surrender. More babies took flight, ballooning away on gossamer threads. Some would die within hours, most would die within days. But some would find their own corners, build their own webs, face their own catastrophes. And some of those would survive, would rebuild, would continue the endless cycle. As the sun climbed higher, painting the room in familiar gold, Arachne settled into her imperfect web. Her body was broken, her masterpiece was gone, but she had won the only victory that mattered. She had rebuilt from nothing. She had protected what she loved. And in a world where giants swept through with brooms, creating dust storms that would be unbelievable to anyone who truly understood their scale, she had survived. The web swayed gently in the air current from the heating vent. Not perfect, but strong. Not beautiful by the standards of her previous work, but beautiful in its defiance, its determination, its absolute refusal to accept defeat. Arachne, the architect, the mother, the survivor, rested at its center. Tomorrow she would hunt. Tomorrow she would reinforce the anchor points. Tomorrow she would continue the work that spiders had been doing since before giants walked the earth. But today, in this moment, as her children scattered to their fates and the morning light caught her imperfect threads, she allowed herself something rare in the life of a spider: peace. The dust storm had been unbelievable, but so was her survival. And somewhere in the house, the broom stood in its closet, innocent and unaware, waiting for the next time the giant decided the corners needed cleaning.